for our fall lecture series. And tonight I am going to be doing an interview with Professor McKenzie Wark. Professor Wark is, I think, one of the most interesting critical theorists writing today. She has, I think, for most of my life, been at the forefront of thinking through the relationship between critical theory, media, technology, and also how our lives, how the kind of political and economic systems that we live in have changed. And she's, I think, argued correctly and forcefully for the idea that we need new ideas and new concepts in order to think about the world we're living in today. So Gamer Theory, the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, was published 15 years ago. It is a book that tries to think about games as a cultural form that kind of match the world we're living in, a world that has kind of been made over like a game, that game language has so infused the world that we're living in that changes our relationship with games and helps us understand what video games are and how they operate. We're not going to be obviously going over everything. It's a pretty dense book, but I encourage you, if you find tonight's conversation interesting, to pick it up. I think it's still free, right? You can just download it on the internet. Is that true? It's still on the internet somewhere? Yeah, okay, so there you go.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming in. It's a fascinating. Some book came about, and I feel like it's just as interesting as the book itself. So, do you want to talk about why you decided to write a book about video games?
I think we're good.
Double check.
academics about what a game was. In game studies, people still do that stuff. And you know, it sort of boils down to games have, you know, sort of artificial constraints internal to them, and they're bounded in time and space, and they have conditions under which they end. So everybody can dispute that if you want, but the games are something like that, yeah. But what if there was no longer a boundedness to the game, but the entire planet had become one game space without end? So there's no, you know, sort of win condition for any individual at all anymore. So it was sort of suspending some of the criteria of the concept of game, the things that make games not terrifying, if you like, is that there's sort of some boundedness, and the obstacles in them are a form of artifice. I think it's, like Bernard Suits in the Grasshopper is like, you could just run across the middle of the field, you know. But it's like we go all the way around. We accept the artifice. Right. But what if you don't get any choice about that anymore? That you're kind of bound by arbitrary conventions and play. So it was trying to think a somewhat bleaker version of what used to be called gamification was pointed towards. It was contemporary with the discussion of gamification would be such a great thing, would get everybody motivated, and now everybody's like, oh, for Christ's sake, we have to rank everybody, and everybody's ranking us. So, and this became a whole Black Mirror thing, yeah. Right. But it's like I was saying that 10 years before Black Mirror, so yeah, I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've always been interested in reading the book is at what level we should take game space as a kind of rhetorical move by the kind of powers that be, a way that they dress up their system as one that has meritocracy, fairness, right? They're using the language of games. Should we take game space as again, a kind of window dressing, or should we take it more literally? And are there aspects that we should take more literally where parts of our lives really have been made over in these structures and in a kind of dark way, like we can't really escape those structures? Like, you talked about the kind of metaphor of cinema. Is game space entirely a metaphor, or should we be on the lookout for how these structures
I think it's real. I think we're kind of in it, yeah. You know, like all of social media became gamified, yeah. So you're looking for, you know, counting, like the ratio is a thing on Twitter. It's basically like 2 scores, like you're looking at a relationship between 2 numbers as a score. So yeah, it's not rhetorical in that sense, but particularly the little overture to the book is very much about how is, and I think, and to me, gamespace is a more useful key to the subjectivity of living in whatever this is. Maybe it's still capitalism, maybe it's worse, but I feel like it's better than always saying neoliberalism. I think that it feels game-like. But game-like also in a bad sense. There seem to be arbitrary rules. It's not clear what the win condition is. Some people definitely get power-ups that you don't get. You know, like all of those things seems like a way of thinking about what it means to be inside this kind of machine that's making you a player in your own life, whether you want to be or not.
Right. Especially at the beginning of the book, and you know, please correct me if I'm characterizing this if I'm getting it wrong, but. At the very beginning of the book...
Yeah, that's totally wrong.
There is no beginning of the book. It's always already begun. The games play a role in game space of at least somewhat as kind of revealing revealing the facade, right? That you do this really interesting move where you're saying, rather than looking at these, or at least in my interpretation, you're saying rather than gamers being people who are trying to escape from the world, in some ways, they are diving towards the very ideals that the world has taught them to seek out. But this is the place that they actually find them, right? Like in the cave TM, which is a phrase you use a lot, right? Do you think that, do you still kind of agree that games have that function? Is that something that, I guess could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, it's a book without romanticism, so there's no outside. There's no sort of idyllic other world that you could go to. There's no counterculture. There's no, you know, kind of light on the hill. So what you're left with is different styles of play, or different ways of being a gamer internal to it, which comes a bit from Hoisinga's Homo Ludens, comes a bit from Bernard Suits also, and actually advocates trifling rather than playing. And I remember we used to talk about spoilers, or all different kinds of ways of thinking about different personas of playing. So it's very much about, oh, okay, so there's an outside, but if I think and play with the internal affordances, maybe there are spaces that are internal to game space that are some kind of respite, and also free from the sort of ideological conviction that you have to win at all costs, right, that sort of thing. So it's not where it's different from Board Society Spectacles. It's not really expecting total revolution to happen to save us and overturn it. But it is very much about being internal to a totality that's now game-like rather than cinema-like.
Right. Yeah, there is that sense that there's no real after in gamer theory, right? There is no revolution that's coming, but there. And we can talk a little bit about the end of the book. There is this sense of games as having some function, perhaps as something a gamer theorist can use to think about the world, right? That at the very least there's something that we can examine the world in light of, in a sense.
I mean, there's a lot of, and it still goes on, of game criticism that's about content and about representation and stuff like that. That's fine. But you get to play as, I get to play as a girl. That's great, I love that. But it's not, it's not really thinking about games in formal terms. And there was a school of the study of the form of games around at the time. There are many debates about this. But people looking at the form of games didn't think those forms could also be homologous with larger structures of late capitalism, early something else. Like the formalist approach to game studies tends to just want to talk about games,
right.
Whereas I wanted to do. So I'm sort of trying both ways. It's a critical theory of games, but I'm not interested in representation or that sort of stuff. It's about form. So it's like, how do you merge those two sort of critical approaches and then look at particular mechanics and structures in games as sort of analogues for things in the real world.
Yeah, you tell a really interesting history of these kind of movements of human life, right? Starting with what you call the kind of topic, right? The topical, which is, I guess, kind of like in the very beginnings, early tribes and villages, right? The world is, mostly shrouded in darkness. You're kind of living and dying 8 miles.
You want to play Civilization?
Yes, they want to play Civilization, right?
It's basically Civilization. It's all dark around you. You have no idea what the map is.
And you talk about how this gives way to a topographic world, the world made over in lines, whether those are roads or the written word, right, is a kind of line that starts to map the world, starts to connect it. And then kind of at the end of that era, you have telesthesia, right? You have these forms of communication that collapse space quite dramatically. And that gives rise to this new era, the era that in the book you assert we're living in, which is kind of the topological, right? The world made over as almost like a logical or a logistics problem, right? Where quantities kind of supersede quality as the most important thing. And this is a world that is ripe for certain kind of processes and algorithms to run it. Is that a fair assessment of the story you're telling?
Yeah, so it's sort of in what way are games kind of already maps of a world that are topological in the sense that you can fold space. And that's the world of supply chains and logistics, where like our ship is probably made in Indonesia at this point, but it was designed in Brooklyn, and so you sort of fold space together using logistics as a way to make that possible. And games seem to me to be good allegories of that, in a way that the sort of map-based or cinematic universe was kind of not. It doesn't quite show you how you can fold space and treat all of it. In a world where GPS sort of surmounts the planet, like the whole space of the planet is a game space, and sort of to be literal-minded about it.
Yeah, and in like purely, to be very top-level, in purely numerical terms, like when do you think this changeover happens? Like, is it very gradual? But like, what is the point at which like we're recognizably inside of some topological space? I ask this because I was really fascinated to go back and read your first book, Virtual Geography, and to see this idea already there, right? Already that you're working with this, trying to grapple with what it means for an event happening X thousands of miles away to be somehow filtered through this place that then finds you in Australia, like trying to make sense of it, and the almost kind of phenomenological experience of what that means. I mean, do you think that that is it? Is it like the mid to late 90s? Is it like, when does topology...
It's got a long history, and this is sort of classic Canadian media theory. Harold Innes is the person who started this with a book called Bias and Communication Empire, the two books. And for me, and James Carey's book, Culture as Communication, is really key. Particularly to James Carey, like the key is how space becomes different when there's telegraphy. Before telegraphy, for information to move through space, it would move at pretty much the same speed as everything else. So markets were local. Arbitrage was just people who had good intuition about differences between markets in different places. They didn't actually know. Telegraphy changes all that. What we think of as market, as an abstraction, is an effect of telegraphy, because you've got price information from different places all at the same time. The modern sense of market is an artifact of telegraphy. It changes military strategy. I mean, that happened during Civil War. Certain battles happened just because telegraphy was possible between certain points, you know. So how does the quality of space change when the information moves faster than the things do? How does the information start to control how the things will be moved? So that's sort of like the basic thing. And it begins with telegraphy, but it's still incredibly difficult and slow. Actually getting telegraphy to work between, say, Sydney, where I'm from, and London, which was the colonial centre, implies you have a line halfway around the world, and then you get answers to, like, why did the British have to colonise certain parts of the Middle East to run the telegraph line to India, which was what they cared about. So you go and destroy entire civilizations to run a wire through it. You know, I'm not exaggerating too much. So it's got, you know, a couple of centuries of prehistory, but there's a point at which communication gets so cheap and so fast that it starts to ever more rapidly control, but not just in terms of speed, but detail, such that if you're gathering very fine-grained detail in real time and feeding that into a game engine, essentially, that's planetary in scale, then you're kind of moving everything in real time around that, right? Because as we know, like, we're shedding streams of data from each of our cell phones, like, constantly just by walking around. The line of time is actually on, or your laptop is on. And kind of engines of calculation are figuring out what to do with that. Most of them economic, but some of them also to do with intelligence gathering and security. Yeah?
So do you feel like, I mean, this is maybe a silly question, but do you feel like, in the way that topography gathered steam, in a way, right, like it took a long time to develop, is topology, is the topological world still developing? Do you have any sense of where it will develop to? Like, you know, it's hard to predict the future, but...
Oh, yeah, and you know, people can forget how rapidly this happened. You know, I did a whole thing on how the Allies invaded the Normandy beaches, and they had no idea what was there. There was this whole sort of process to try to figure out what the actual beaches were like. What was the grade, what kind of sand? Like, no one knew that. Like, now you could just look all that shit up. You could just go and invade anywhere based on very fine-grained information that you could already have. But even middle of last century, you know, like, no one knew anything. You kind of had maps, and they're often wildly inaccurate. So there's a way in which we've entered the beginnings of the world, really only maybe 20, 30 years ago, and where she's running out of, like, the base level world to build off. Because a lot of people have fantasies of going to Mars, because we'll like run out of, like, the actual planet underneath the game space can't support it anymore. So the fantasy is that we'll find another one, which is sort of not really going to work, but, you know, whatever. Yeah. And the finance piece is kind of fascinating, where the way that works now is that you're sort of doing kind of arbitrage between all of the activities that are actually going on and then all of the possible alternative activities that could be happening at the same time. Like that's derivatives. So we have a bigger economy that's a game on top of the actual game of the moving stuff around the game. So we just build games on top of games, you know, like that's game space.
Right, yeah. And I think the thing that I always try to communicate to students when I teach this is, you know, the title's important, right? Because especially at the time it came out, if a book was called Gamer Theory, it was almost always a book about gamers. Right? It was a theory of gamers. What are they doing? What are they about? But your book is not that. Your book is saying there's a kind of theory that gamers can do, that they have a position in the world that's different than, you know, the people who engage primarily with other forms of media, like written media, the literary or the cinematic. And only they can do that theory. And you're trying to kind of sketch out what that might look like, what it would mean. Do you think that's still true today? Do you think there's still a kind of theory that gamers can do now? Or is something changed in the last 15 years where gamers are no longer a kind of, not a privileged position, but a kind of particular position? Like, has the spread of topological, the kind of game space, made all of us somewhat closer to the gamer you were imagining 15 years ago?
There's a moment when a form is just sort of gathering steam, where people are more aware of it and more self-conscious about it. And there obviously been games for a long time, and you know I was playing Space Invaders when I was 12 in the 70s, you know, so it's not, you know, completely novel. But there was still a sense of the novelty of inventing a culture around games in the early, God, I'm not going to say early 21st century.
Yes.
And it's maybe worth trying to keep hold of that. I mean, the thing that happened a decade after this was written was Gamergate, right? And a whole other model of who the gamer was. But I still think there's ways you can develop a conceptual practice out of the playing, or even better, designing of games as a particular way of thinking, a particular way of interacting with the world, a particular set of aesthetics, a particular set of forms. And I'm interested in how practices give rise to sort of specific kinds of conceptual and critical possibility. And I've sort of done it 3 times. There was a Hacker Manifesto, Game Theory, and the one I'm just signing off on is about ravers.
Oh.
So I've done hackers, gamers, and ravers, you know. I think the fourth one's going to be hustlers.
Hustlers, okay, all right, excellent. Yeah, it's interesting because to me, as someone who thinks a lot about the game industry and works inside of it, it has always been interesting to me since reading your book how much the kind of forefront of some of the protocols, the kind of models of control that you talk about in the book, show up in games first, right? That like, we no longer live in the era where when you release a PC game, you also release the tools to mod it. You also release it's not never seen anymore, but it's far less common than it used to be, where there was much more of a kind of hacker culture, a belief that gamers were closer to hackers in your sense than we expect now. And now we have many, many more forms where you don't even own the game, right? Like this is something that is being, you know, leased to you for a brief amount of time and can be taken away at any time, right? We have entire games that are funded by economies of value that are just people, right? Pictures of people that don't have any use value.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that in Hacker Manifesto, is that we don't get to own the artifacts of our own culture anymore. Like, we're actually now just, you know, renting back our own culture. Like, all of it gets appropriated. I was just hesitating about downloading a book from Kindle on my phone to have something to read on the way, and it's like, God damn it! Like, I don't actually get that book. I just get leaseholder rights on it. So yeah, we all became tenants.
Yeah.
Not just in Brooklyn, but in culture. But we make the culture. We are the culture. Like, we make it. It's our labor. But we don't get to own it. And we don't and barely get to lease it, because they can change the terms at any time. Suddenly they'll yank something off your phone and you wonder where it went.
Yeah, that is a good chance to kind of transition to talking about the rest of the work, right? So you wrote a Hacker Manifesto right before this, and that's the book I think still that you're probably best known for, right? It was It was
Better or
within a
worse.
very big splash. I remember in grad school it being a very, very, very big deal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found was interesting in going back and reading them in order, right? I decided this summer, because I knew this was coming, I was like, well, I'll take these books and I'll read them in order for the first time and see what that's like. And it was interesting to me how much the terms that you use in Hacker Manifesto, the idea of vectors and vectoralism, the sense of the hacker class, some of that's in virtual geography, but it does show up in the rest of your work going forward, right? Your most recent book, Capital is Dead, is very much kind of trying, it's kind of doing a lot of what Hacker Manifesto was doing, except, you know, maybe making it slightly more accessible, right? And what's interesting to me reading gamer theory is how little of that language is there, right? Like hacker appears at the very end, and all of the ideas are there, right? Like you can, if you've read your other work, you can see how gamer theory fits into it. But it is interesting that, like, yeah, the idea of vector and vectoralism doesn't show up, when it's such a powerful and important idea for the rest of your work. Is there a reason that you decided to write gamer theory in kind of its own?
Haven't really
space?
thought of that. There's a way maybe the language comes out of the particular critical objects and practices. And I had thought about, I actually wrote a new preface for it for the French edition. And maybe that tries to do that work with synthesis to feed it back into the other work. This book, Capital is Dead, which I did maybe a year ago, was very much about rewriting a Hacker Manifesto, like a little bit slightly less laborious language. And also it's ironic, given that it's a book of, you know, Hacker Manifesto is a book against intellectual property, but I feel like it got widely plagiarized. Like, people straight up fucking stole shit from me. And I was just like putting my name back on it, like, you know, and I actually like quote that book, you know, in Capital is Dead. And that's sort of like the main spine of thinking through what are the consequences for the technical changes in media form, for how this becomes a different political economy, and maybe one that's not even capitalism anymore, but worse. Like, that's sort of the idea I wanted to reestablish. And Hacker Manifesto was sort of optimistic about how it was transformable, and gamer theory is not. Now I think about it, the book on raves is sort of actually pessimistic, like gamer theory, but it also has a separate language, like the concepts in it are sort of distinctive to it. So I don't know, maybe that's there's like the main spine of sort of conceptual work, and then the two little sort of much more bleak, pessimistic books about, you know, specific practices.
Yeah, it starts out sunny, and then the trilogy is darkness. I would like to talk a little bit about vectoralism, because it's such an important idea for you. It's there from the very beginning, this idea that rather than the kind of structures of power in the world being about the controlling of the means of production, right? That they are really controlling the kind of means of communication, right? That it's who controls the movement of information around the world, both in the sense of owning the pipes to some extent, but also just kind of owning the IP, right? That like this idea of intellectual property is a really important turn in understanding how the era we're living in is different than the kind of the thing that we're usually trying to describe when we say capitalism, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a way in which the whole modern period is about ever more refined forms of abstraction, and how you can kind of control production processes at a sort of ever more abstract level. And the innovation of capitalism was the factory. You know? It's like you control the production process by internalizing the workers inside the machine, essentially. But it's still a huge, great hulking machine. You know, I'm from a steel town. There were giant factories everywhere. You know, so it's abstract, but still incredibly materially embodied. But what if you just outsource all of that to somewhere else and like control it remotely, which you control the information and every piece of the information. You control the intellectual property, which determines the kind of product that gets made. You control the supply chain, logistics, so you know exactly where all of the inputs and outputs are going. all the market information is at your fingertips, so you know when the consumers are buying it off the shelf, because that's contemporary business, yeah? Like none of that was possible in the 20th century. So agency still was in owning the means of production, but I think, you know, agency and power now is in controlling the vector, meaning the line of information that's connecting all those things together. So most of the big companies whose logos you see everywhere, they don't really own a damn thing. Yeah, like Apple doesn't make phones, right? I mean, now there's infrastructure to all these things, like Google has an enormous infrastructure, right? But it doesn't have giant factories. All the shit's made by somebody else. And the workforce that's employed is like a fraction of what a company like Ford used to employ. Yeah. So how is it possible to more abstractly control anything really, but particularly production processes or production and consumption cycles? And how is that really not quite capitalism anymore, but something else, where information becomes the central thing rather than capital itself?
And there's also the character of the hacker, right? The person who, you know, the person who produces abstractions, right? In your framework, right? The person who is not a worker, right? Like tearing, you know, material in the world and putting it into a shape, right? And giving that to someone else, right? It is a person who is sitting and coming up with the things, the intellectual property that the vectoralists are making their money off of, right? This idea, these ideas that are more powerful and someone else is responsible for necessarily making them.
I mean, the whole idea of labor in capitalism is you make the same thing. So you sort of abstract the making down to particular separate processes. So everybody's just sitting there doing the same thing over and over again. And the human's still there because the human's cheaper than getting a machine to do it, right? But sameness is what that's all about. But the kind of work most of us aspire to do is not that. We're here to not end up doing that, right? So it means you've got to produce difference. You've got to produce something that's information. Information is the difference that makes a difference, Jeffrey Bateson. So that's sort of our job. And in New York City, there's sort of basically two kinds of work now, right? There's that and there's service work to make it all possible. So how do you get into that where you're making things where the problem is you usually don't end up owning and controlling all of the consequences of whatever novelty you end up producing, but hopefully you get some benefit from it, yeah?
Right.
Maybe I'll do a little research project on trans women in the tech industry. It's like this weird little bubble that some of my sisters ended up in. And it's kind of like, oh, you found a place to hide. But you only do it by making your like weird brain productive. So you can sit there at the computer and come up with something, you know, within the constraints of whatever language you learned and so on. Yeah. So the whole of New York City is one of these factories that manufactures novel information. Not so much directly around code, although that's certainly a thing that happens here, but around sort of branding and marketing. And it's a center for financial information, legal information, accounting information. You know, everybody you see in coffee shops has got the laptop open, right? And doing one of those things.
Yeah.
But it's not quite labor in the traditional sense. It's still work, but it's not, you're not making sameness, you're making difference.
And your argument is that hackers should recognize themselves as a class. That at least in the Hacker Manifesto, maybe that's changed, and I think that is somewhat changing. I'm actually friends with some of the people at Google who have tried to sort of start a union. They're trying to really thinking of themselves as a class and thinking of themselves in conflict with you know, the information overlords that they work for. But you think your advice is that if the hackers could find some solidarity with more traditional, you know, workers, service workers, that sort of thing, that is, at least in the Hacker Manifesto, a path towards some kind of, you know, solution. Maybe not solution, but to somewhere better than where we might otherwise be going.
I mean, as far as this political economy is concerned, it doesn't really care what kind of information you made. All of it can be turned into forms of intellectual property. So then why do we find ourselves at odds over really essentially cultural differences? People trained as humanists and people trained as scientists are supposed to beat each other's throats about I don't even know what. But it's like our job is the same. You know, we just have different protocols.
I'm out. Sorry.
creative, like good person qualities. It became associated with criminalization. Ravers is a weird little underground thing, and I just reconnected with that after a bit of an absence, but there are others, and we're all encouraged to be hustlers. I'm supposed to have a side hustle. I love the word hustle. We'll investigate what it means to do that. Particularly in an era where socially acceptable, like the things that can be a hustle, has kind of like changed for certain classes of people.
Oh no.
I see. Bring out the big guns. Hello.
Is this on? All right. So, hustle.
Is this thing working? Yeah, so I still think class is kind of an open question. Maybe there's a different kind of ruling class that doesn't actually directly own the means of production anymore, but owns the vector of information. There is still labor. There are still peasants in the world. But is there a class of information producer that many of us belong to or aspire to belong to that the ruling class would dearly love to proletarianize and find ways to stop us having money? My job, college professor, being abolished as we speak, right? Yeah, how do you make all of that way less fun, like these used to be great jobs where you got to create information or share it with people, but like entire industries are now devoted to destroying that and stopping that from happening.
It's remarkable too, because one of the things that has happened in the last 15 years is that gamer has become more of a description of someone's job, right? That with streaming and games as a kind of performance, if the people who actually I now think of as using the term gamer to most often self-describe aren't even the kind of leftovers of Gamergate. It's streamers, right? It's people who work on Twitch 8 hours a day, almost like, AM radio hosts that just have to produce an enormous amount of content that they have only the lightest bit of control over often, right? They have no means of reaching any of their actual audience except through these portals that are held by other people.
Yeah, the game is content production, and then your immediate rivals are producing content in the same genre, but your rivals in general is everybody else producing content, all of whom are sort of fighting over scraps, and none of whom own the vector itself, right? We don't own Twitch, or whichever, name your platform, and there are many. There used to be this idea of the culture industries, and it's like, that now seems nostalgic because they actually made the movies and records and stuff for us. Now you got to make it yourself. They just give you this empty thing and you got to fill it and get your friends to put stuff in it. So even the production of the content, bar a few, sort of like giant, superhero movies, we got to make all this stuff ourselves.
And then we can't even monetize it ourselves, right? Like we don't even have.
There's no way to monetize. Yeah. There's no way to make a living off it, because the system of control, kind of makes you compete with everybody else for attention more than anything else. And good luck monetizing that. Everybody's got a T-shirt line now,
Everyone has swag, even the Game Center, by the way. There's a couple of things I want to talk about before we turn it over to questions. One is I have to talk about Hoisinga. So Hoisinga has been an influence for you, I think, mostly through the Situationists, right? Mostly for the effect that he has on folks like Guy Debord and some others. His book, Homo Ludens, when I teach our theory course, Intro to Game Studies, I begin with Homo Ludens and I end with Gamer Theory. Because I think of them as kind of sequels, or I think of Gamer Theory as a kind of sequel. Like at the end of Homo Ludens, which is itself a very dark book in a lot of ways, Hoisinga is basically talking about how he thinks play is dying out of the world, right? That the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, the desire of people for a kind of automaticity and a kind of unmoving structure to their lives. They're so shocked and frightened by modernity that they are turning to powerful bureaucrats or strongmen or that sort of thing. And he's like, the play spirit is kind of leaving the world. And fast forward to Gamer Theory, and I have always interpreted it as saying, yes, that is correct. Play is dead. Play has been dead for a while, and now all that's left is games, or at least play is foreclosed. Is that a fair, I would love to know your thoughts on Hoisinga, and I wonder if that's a fair interpretation of how to think about these two books in relationship to each other.
Yeah, I mean, for Hoisinga, it's kind of a good thing that play sort of calcifies out into games, so long as the games remain modifiable and can be elaborated and recreated. But at some point, he sort of feared that they would, like that spirit would, cease to be, and there'd be kind of enclosure of play entirely within games, that they're unmodifiable structures. And I kind of think that's where we ended up in some ways. You get to play within, but you don't really get to own the space at all. It became an enclosed game space, not a play space. Yeah, it's a really important book. And as far as I remember, Hoisinga wrote it in 1938.
Yeah, it's published in 1938.
Yeah, just
writes it very quickly before that.
Yeah, just before the Nazis roll into Holland. And he kind of held the line, as I understand it. He's a good guy, historically speaking. And quite conservative in a lot of ways. Like the book on the waning of the Middle Ages is wonderful, and I recommend that if people read that as well. There's a new translation too. The book it argues against the Marxists, like it's about play, not labor. And Hacker Manifesto was already trying to synthesize those two things, the perspective that everything's about labor and the perspective that it's all about play. It also argues at the very beginning against Carl Schmitt. It became a huge deal in political theory, the idea that politics is the struggle to the death. Every relation is a friend-enemy relation. And as Hoisinga points out, like in the first 3 pages, it's like the struggle to the death is just no fun, because who's there to witness your victory? Like, right? And this was already Hegel, yeah? Like mercy is worse than killing your enemy, because then the enemy there is continually to be reminded of their own defeat. Yeah. So there's kind of a play in relation to Schmitt and what would become Schmitt's influence. Relevant for those who don't know that Schmitt was a big Nazi, right? Yes. So like play is a way to do conflict differently. So yeah, that book was really important. I read it because I was working on the Situations International, for whom it was important. And that and Bernard Suits, actually, probably the two main influences.
The Grasshopper.
Yeah. I love The Grasshopper. That's a wild book. And I have that beautiful University of Toronto edition, with the illustrations and everything. Yeah, that was the other one that was I think, formative.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that is a book, especially in relation to gamer theory, that's a book that's about utopia, right? Like, that is a book about the idea that if we somehow reached utopia, the only thing left to do would be to play games, which would be to set artificial boundaries for ourselves.
Yeah.
And gamer theory is kind of saying that, at least for some people, that has happened, right? That, like, scarcity, we are no longer wringing a life out of necessity, I think is the phrase you used a couple of times. But that is not as utopian as, or at least the system that brought us there is not as utopian as Suits might have hoped.
I mean, the context for that was the lingering influence of New Games movement and that sort of like hippie sense of play as a way out of what they saw as the sort of Moloch of industrial capitalism. What they didn't realize is they're creating its replacement, which would be worse. So it's sort of critique in advance of where some of that energy ended up. Well, even though some of that stuff was kind of great, and who am I thinking of? Who was the founder of that? No, I'm blanking on his name.
De Koven, you mean?
Yes, De Koven. Yeah. That stuff was great. And some of the stuff about the well-played game, I think, as almost as an ethics of play is actually really useful. But to think it as far less utopian, but the little affordances you're trying to find in a game space that's essentially sucking value out of everything you do.
Yeah, there's also the part in Suits that I've always found fascinating, which is where he talks about the idea that actually play is the exception, that like games are more common in the world, that it's more common that things form these structures and this order rather than something more spontaneous and more adaptable, more moddable in a kind of Hoisingan sense. Which also feels very gamer theory,
Yeah, and I think I got from Suits obviously is allegory. Like it's all based around the story of the grasshopper and the ants. Like I love that about that book. It's the ants reconstructing the philosophy of the grasshopper.
Yeah.
Didn't quite go that far, but I used Plato's Cave, and
Yes,
it's like,
yeah.
what if Plato's Cave was about a game? You know, like that's sort of the...
Yeah, it's what makes Grasshopper and Gamer Theory fun to teach together, right? Is this reference back to Plato. All right, I have one more thing I want to talk about. Well, I'm going to see. I think, yeah, just one more thing. I've spent most of my career and most of my research thinking about multiplayer games. And you, for this book, exclusively talk about single-player games. And there's this great line that I've had highlighted for you, so I'm going to read it to you. Perhaps the game is collapsing back into business as usual. Perhaps the single-player game will become an anachronism superseded by multiplayer worlds as venal and benighted as the rest of gamespace. So, first off, ouch, that hurts. But secondly, you're definitely right? I mean, I think that like the funny thing is that has begun apace in the last 5 or 6 years, and I would predict, I put money down on the idea that 5 or 6 years from now, like the games as service model, even if it is single player, but a kind of like pseudo multiplayer world, that like single player games of the type that you were playing for Gamer Theory are going to feel like going to the opera, right? It's like, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, I love it, I grew up listening, my parents were opera singers, I love that world, but it's clearly an anachronism in many ways, right? It's an anachronism maintained by an enormous amount of wealth, an enormous amount of people who just don't want to let this thing go, I think, luckily for us. This is a very throwaway line, and like you kind of don't elaborate on it. I would love to hear you elaborate on it now, if you'd like. I know it's probably been a while since you thought about that line, but.
To be honest, I never liked multiplayer games that much. Like, my entire life is social. I'm a professor, I do shows all the time. So like, gaming was just me and the machine, you know. And also I was interested in the human-machine relation. And at least at the time, there was a turn to studying multiplayer in game studies, and it was all intersubjective. Like, it actually didn't look at the human machinic anywhere near as much. And I wanted to sort of keep that focus. And there were just so many beautiful single-player games. Like, I really want to get, like, Rares out and see if I can make it run again. I still have the disc for that, because it was allegedly based on raving. And now that I'm doing that again, now I want to play that game and like revisit that.
It's one of the most beautiful chapters in the book. I love that chapter. Just by itself, it's such a wonderful appreciation of that game and a really interesting like idea about targeting and what makes someone something and a connection. It's really, really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It's got kick-ass music too, which you sort of control. Like you make the soundtrack as you go, and really recommend Res. If you have PlayStation 2,
I think you can get on everything.
There's probably emulators for it now. Yeah.
All right. Well, I got that out of my system, so thank you. All right. So the last thing I want to ask you is, so in your first book, in Virtual Geography, there's this idea that the event might be something that the vector has to metabolize and might change the way it functions and works, right? That book is about these different events that the storylines that the vector controls have to adapt around and the process in which they do that. In A Hacker Manifesto, you talk about hackers joining in solidarity with other workers. In Gamer Theory, you suggest that you have to kind of work and beyond simple negations as a way of surviving or finding a place outside, or not even outside, but someplace inside but beyond games. It's very hard. It's kind of hard to conceptualize. But and then in Capital is Dead, your most recent book, or at least the most recent book I've read, you call for a kind of vulgar Marxism, right? A turn away from the genteel Marxism of the academy, or if that's fair to say, and a kind of imagining and getting back in touch with a vulgar Marxism. So each of these books has a kind of different thing that it's suggesting. Is there unity to these ideas, or is this just different strategies by which you're attacking the problem that unites all of these books, which is how do we operate in this world? How do we operate within vectoralism?
I mean, it's all just Marxism and media theory. What if you took the form of technical relations as primary, and what if you thought about labor/play as a practice, as the foundational thing out of which everything is built? Like, those are the two basic ideas. So each of the books has its own, and I really do think in books, I don't like writing articles, each of the books has its own kind of conceptual and aesthetic unity. And some of the books were actually written using game strategies, particularly gamer theory, but they all had them actually. Game theory is the only one where it was explicit, that there are a set of constraints that it worked under. So like, I feel like there's a consistent practice there, but I didn't want to be one of those people who wrote the same book over and over again. So each one is a sort of its own like distinctive little artifact, except a couple have sequels. But so it's like, how does the practice of writing about a specific thing generate a kind of a book that's a totality, that's a little separate?
Its own topic.
Yeah, but I'm gonna like steal from my own previous stuff and rework it and play with it, as artists do. I'm an artist as far as I'm concerned. You know, just don't tell the people who tenured me. It's really just
All right.
an art practice.
I promise. Well, thank you very much. That was an amazing conversation. Let's turn it over to a little round of applause. Thank you, Naomi. And I guess I can get up and pass the mic around, but are there any questions for Professor Wark from you all? Yes.
Thank you. So I was interested in the information part, because I was interested in misinformation. What is that to you? Is that like, is it a portion of information? Is it another path, or is it standing at odds with information?
How long have we got? Thank you. Yeah, like information is, just to start with information, it's a really slippery category to begin with, and is maybe information hovers between pattern and novelty, and is only misinformation in certain circumstances. Misinformation as a category implies that there's information that's correct, whereas, and there are ways in which one establishes systems to try to stabilize that, like to stabilize relations of information in relation to practices. That's what the sciences do, yeah? You know, science doesn't really know if things are true. Sciences know when you can stabilize information about a particular thing. It's like, all right, we did the experiments and we redid them and somebody else did them and then we did them again. And so we're stabilizing that as a result. But there's this whole apparatus that makes that happen, of the journals and the laboratories and all that. So we stabilize that. And then if you're saying something contrary to that, then that's misinformation. So Earth round, settled. It's not a flat disk. Australia actually exists. There are flat Earth people who believe Australia's a myth. That I'm a paid agent of NASA. This is misinformation. But the misinformation is always relative, I think. Like, yep, that's clearly misinformation. Earth being round is actually not, more like orange-shaped, you know. So there's degrees of it. So I don't know, maybe the way to think it is that the misinformation's always in any information practice, but how do you stabilize and contain it? How do you do, it's terrible to say it's easier in the sciences, but it probably is. How do you stabilize that in the social domain seems an impossible condition at the moment. We used to rely on scarcity and control of channels to do that. When I grew up, there were only 5 television channels, so editorial decisions were made. It didn't always mean everything was correct, but certain kinds of wild information didn't happen, and we lost that. We just completely rewired the central nervous system of the entire planet, where it's really only the market decides if information is of value. Whether it's misinformation or not doesn't matter. So that's turning out to be a huge problem for which we don't really have solutions. Or we have solutions that the people who make an enormous amount of money off the circulation of any information, regardless of its quality, would rather we don't implement. So in other words, Facebook has to be regulated. Immediately.
Over there? Oh, that's not a hand up. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for the talk, it was great. I was thinking about what you were saying about the culture industry, like kind of not existing so much anymore, or maybe disappearing because people are making stuff themselves. it seems like maybe naively like there should be some kind of potential there if we really do have to make content for ourselves for it to be more political or more consciousness raising or transformative or something. Do you think that's happening, or if it's not, do you have any thoughts like why that's not happening?
Yeah, I talk about it. We don't have the culture industries. Well, they still exist, obviously. There'll be some sort of Marvel movie will drop around Thanksgiving, right? So there's still a culture industry, but most of what we're inside is what I call a vulture industry. It's just like picking the flesh off. You know, it doesn't actually like make anything. And there's the thing about that is the affordances of it are like good and bad. So yes, there's a hell of a lot of super interesting. I went back to rave culture, so I'm obsessed with like techno mixers. So techno is black music, so I find all of the black DJs who create it, and they're able to put their stuff up, and they put their stuff up on SoundCloud, which means they can work and so on. That's all great, but the thing is the affordances of all of those media also mean that there's neo-Nazi art out there somewhere, you know. They seem to like really bad punk rock though. They don't really, you know. You know, so the thing is there's no necessary alignment between those affordances and the culture that one might want, because like everybody has access to the same tools and the same practices and the same sort of lack of opportunity to kind of make money out of it.
Hello, Professor Wark. Baudrillard had this provocation that Disneyland is the purpose of the point of Disneyland is to cover up for the fact that the rest of the world is already fake and simulation. Do you think video games have the same function as in like covering up for the fact that the rest of the world is already a game space?
Yeah, there's a way that it feels like, and it's sort of the premise of gamer theory that, you know, like but it was about single player games, but they seem fair. Like everybody starts the same game. Yeah, there were sort of ways to cheat, but the cheat is actually inside the rules. Like it isn't really cheating. So it seems fair, and when you win a game, it seems like you really did it because, you know, you did well. Whereas in the game space of the real world, it's like, did that other person really get that job because they were better than me? Or was it because they went to the same school as the person doing the hiring? You know, like in the game space world, you're sort of like, wait a minute, there aren't really like fair rules here at all. Whereas when it's just me and the machine, it really feels like the game is a game like it should be. And if I lost, I deserve to, and if I won, I deserve to. Whereas then you go back out in the world and you're like, nah, wait, this is not, you know, those rules aren't being observed. And there's definitely different law for different people, right? So like to the extent that that's part of the game. So it's like Brett Kavanaugh, it turns out, could get away with pretty much anything and still become a Supreme Court judge. Whereas if you're kind of like some other kinds of people, just walking down the street will get you arrested. So games seem better than that, yeah? But then the ideology of game sort of makes it seem like you have to accept the rest of it as fair and we all got where we are in our merits, when it's sort of not really true.
Thank you. Over here, I think.
Hi. You mentioned Marxism during the talk, and actually myself is a deep Marxist. I'm also having game studies with Charles and had a couple of readings. And right now I'm thinking about like the connection between Marxism and games. Really hope you can judge me if I'm right or wrong. So my thinking is like this. Charles mentioned Hoisinga's Homo ludens during the talk, like especially Nazis and totalitarianism. People like, if some great change happened in society, like people tend to find some place safe and doesn't change, like Nazi. And in my thinking, like Nazi and Soviet Union are like the safe place for people to escape, and the big game companies in the world today is like the safe place for gamer to escape, because like for example, Nintendo like protects their game pretty well, and if you like people, if they make fan arts or recreate something from the game, Nintendo will like sue you. That's like the totalitarianism in the game industry. And interestingly, Nintendo was writing up after the fall of Atari. So that's corresponding to the history pretty well. And on the other hand, in the gaming industry, there are also like indie developers or companies that allows moddings like Skyrim or GTA. Like the players run their own community and produce mods for free. Like they're not working for money, they're working for themselves, like for their own benefits. That's also a form of communism. So I feel like in today's gaming industry, some big companies that don't allow their game to change is on the end of Stalinism, and modding community and indie developers are on the end of Trotskyism. Yeah.
It's an interesting analogy, yeah. I wouldn't want to push it too far, given, I mean, the Nazis exterminated 6 million people in the Holocaust, and 20 million Soviet soldiers died in World War II. The thing is, the kind of labor that goes into building the actual artifacts of, the kind of consumer game world is probably not much better than that when you think about the labor gulags where these are, like the consoles and things are actually manufactured now. So on one hand, it seems like an excessive metaphor, but on the other hand, maybe not, given that, the government of certain Latin American companies just suddenly changed hands because of concern about the lithium that was, under the ground in it. So the kind of geopolitics of the 20th century may have its 21st century equivalent in kind of attempts to control in a totalitarian way, as you're suggesting, exactly what resources are controlled and owned, not so much by states anymore, but kind of giant vectoral companies, of which Nintendo is one of the players, yeah. And very controlling, as I understand it.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your answers so far. This was a bit of a offhanded comment that you made, but I want to see if you just have more extended thoughts. I've been really interested in maybe tracing the lines of a legacy between queer people and technology companies, and thinking about kind of like alternative like labor, people like recognized labor and sex workers, and kind of like how that relationship has kind of always existed, but maybe hasn't been very visible until recently. And then how those groups have fed into maybe alternative technology making practices, game making practices, and like uses of this. Does this also kind of like collapse into the things that you're talking about here? Or is this some sort of either other form of labor or other form of action that kind of maybe troubles something here? I'm just looking for an extension.
Yeah, I think Jacob Gabery wrote a book about looking at queerness in the history of computation, starting with Alan Turing's most obvious. As far as anybody knows, Claude Shannon wasn't gay or queer at all, but deeply strange as a kind of person, So like interesting in a different category of alternate humannesses, if you like. And I think there's more to be said about that, of tracing through not just to the extent to which the space of the avant-garde of kind of techniques and forms of life is a space you're likely to find queer people and also trans people for that matter. So many trans women particularly in the history of computing and its relation to music, interestingly, is a whole other thing that you can do. So yeah, I think there's still entire books to be written to trace some of that out, particularly for eras where people couldn't be out or very public. Would be really good to know. And then, yeah, I think there's probably just the beginnings of conversations that can be had publicly, to pick up the other thread there of where is sex work broadly defined in the culture of contemporary cultural creation and invention. Like how proximate is that, and how connected is it? How is it one of the essential industries the city runs on? But has always kind of kept kind of under wraps. Although there's a sort of fluctuating history in the tolerance of it that's got to do with who owns which part of the city and when and what's supposed to happen and so forth. So it'll be interesting to map those things together, particularly in thinking of cities as gamified spaces of play for the moving of information around. Like cities are kind of like just, like theme parks for creating stuff other people can turn into commodities at some point, and rely on a certain repression, but then also hypocritical tolerance of all kinds of quote-unquote deviance. Like that's the history of the city. So there are lots and lots of things that one could pick up out of that. Yeah. And as a trans woman, all those things intersect for me because so many trans women can't do anything except sex work. So I just know so many more. I always knew sex workers because I'm from a port town, but there's so many more in my life because that's community. And you kind of see how that meshes into all of these other economies. Yeah.
We've got some questions from the chat on Twitch, where we have many.
Hi, chat people.
Yeah. All right. So here's one from Trans Kafka, who asks, do you find a crossover between raves and play spaces?
Ooh, absolutely. And depends what is meant by play spaces there. If you're meaning like play parties for sex, then yeah, and there's raves that have those. Usually just called darkroom in that space, and a little more for gay men in the space of the New York queer raves that I would know. But those sort of overlap a lot. And I think there's like a continuum of, this was so clear during the lockdown year, there's a continuum of people whose sense of how to endure emotionally and sensually is much more distributed. And those are the people who I think suffered most when we all were forced back into the private property of roommates or like a couple or a family or anything like that. It was especially harmful for people who need forms of distributed touch and play outside of that. And that definitely affected the overlapping population of ravers and party people that I was acquainted with. Not all of whom made it out to the other end, because there was, and it became very much a harm reduction thing. I'll admit I went to a lot of outdoor raves during the lockdown, but it seemed like managing different forms of harm reduction, because it's like, yep, there's risk of transmitting COVID in this, but if some people don't get to do this, they're going to fucking kill themselves. So how do we weigh up different forms of harm reduction so that we're maximizing people staying alive and having lived through the beginnings of the HIV pandemic? I'm very familiar with that sort of trade-off. So if that was what was meant, yes, those things kind of connect, sometimes literally in the space of rave. But I think in terms of practices of distributed sensuality, if you like, call it that. The thing is, there's a very, and I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but there can be like a sex nerd side to play space culture, contracts and exchanges of questionnaires. I'm not against it. It's all good. But rave doesn't have that. It's much more intuitive about how you negotiate those things. I really have no opinion about which is best able to minimize harm. I don't know.
That makes me want to ask a follow-up question about whether Hoisinga would see the proliferation of rules in BDSM play spaces as a calcification of play into.
Yeah, I kind of do, but I don't want to be judgy about that because it's not really my world. I just dabble in that. It's not, you know. There's a lot of debate in rave space about rules and police mentality, because it does have to have rules. But when are you being the cop? And that's a very difficult conversation.
Yes, I've got one more question from the chat, and Trans Kafka says, thank you for the answer. This one's from Bootleg Daria. Do gaming fiascos, such as Cyberpunk 2077, which are meant to lose capitalist critiques, confirm Mark Fisher's theory on anti-capitalism as no longer the antithesis of capitalism, in your opinion?
I'm not sure I follow all of the pieces of it. I mean, I think that particular massively failed game is really a labor story of just how, like, super exploiting labor on the one hand and making a whole bunch of, like, super speculative pitches and promises on the other is just not a great business model. And it's probably worth looking at how, because it came late, game industry is not unionized in the way that Hollywood got to do before the Cold War. Sort of, you know, really had at that unionization. So, and there are ways that's undermined by things like reality TV and stuff like that, but there still is a unionized core in that culture industry that games never had. And probably not unrelated to how you get, you know, kind of massive failure, because, you know, bosses just have this idea that making workers incredibly miserable must somehow be succeeding. But it doesn't sort of work when you're trying to get creative labor out of people somehow. I don't know, when people who do what we do are incredibly miserable, we don't seem to do our best work. Isn't that strange? And you know, so the smart money knows that, yeah? Yeah, there's so much pressure in certain tech industries, but at least they know that that labor can walk. You know, your best people can walk, so how are you keeping them? So, you know, things that game industry doesn't really have, like unlimited paid leave. You know, I know people who get that and actually take it, and their managers are like, please take your leave. You look like you're not happy. Go away for a while, because their industry only wants their brain at peak functionality. Like, they don't need them showing up and being miserable at work and doing fuck all and pretending to do the job. They just need that one thing, right? So the thing you might be paying this person 6 figures for, in any given week, it might be 15 minutes of work. But it's extremely valuable, rather than having them, you know, like, as some of us have done in office jobs, pretend to work. So that's how I see it more. I knew Mark Fisher personally a little bit. We met a few times, and I liked him personally. I like some of the writing, particularly around music. But there's a way that too much came to rest on the affect of understanding neoliberalism as affect. And I actually think it was a fairly limited take on, and everything I've been trying to do for 20 years is to not do that. So I appreciate the writing on music, but I didn't think the theoretical work really is that strong. But I see why it's appealing, because it's affective.
Thanks. I think, Eric, you
May I? Was that all the questions from online for now? Thanks. This was a really delightful, sparkling conversation. Really enjoyable. I wanted to maybe go back to the very first thing that you two were talking about, which is gamer space. And maybe I feel like I'm retreading it, but I also feel like I just want to push on it a little bit more. And this whole idea of the relationship between the inside and outside of a game, what was going on when you wrote Gamer Theory, what's happening now. Because I'm just thinking about, like, the recent revelations within the last week of the idea that, I mean, it's no surprise, but that Facebook was doing the research that's incredibly damning and then keeping that research secret from its own employees and, about the own harm that its systems does. And I think about the rise of, the business models that have to do with addicting players or kind of subliminally getting people to spend money without realizing that they are, tricking them into subscription programs or whatever it is, that digital games really did pioneer on a creative level a lot of this behavioral psychology that became aestheticized or mixes in with narrative or with fictional identities and all of the things that like you said earlier, gamification was a utopian thing and now is I think becoming accepted as sort of like
It was never utopian to me.
Right. Fair enough. Yes, agreed on that. But I think that so I guess my question is, really, are we living in the kind of dystopia that games help give birth to? Aren't we already in this? Hasn't it already happened? In a sense, hasn't the kind of this vision of the dark side of the vision of gamer theory, aren't we living in that now?
Yeah.
Increasingly enmeshed. All right, so that's, I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, if I'm being vain, I think my little book was kind of prophetic, that it's how it worked out. And you could sort of see elements of it, just even in those quite kind of aesthetically pleasing and actually sometimes quite adorable PlayStation games that I was writing about. And the glory that was Civilization 3, I think I played. Mm-hmm. That was the hardest one. That took me forever, and I had to look at forums. Or Res was such a beautiful thing. I can't even remember. And Sims was an amazing game. Yeah. So there were ways that those things were, sort of aesthetically pleasing and interesting as forms, but were sort of pointing to a dark place. But the same is true of cinema. It's this gorgeous art form, but one of the things that it pointed to was fascism.
So then thinking about our context right now, which is NYU Game Center has brought you here. The people in this room and many people watching online are people that want to make games or contribute to this. What would be your provocation to game designers, game creators, people that want to be involved in game culture?
I think it's the same as in any kind of creative practice, which is to not kid ourselves about who we're working for, that we're kind of internal to something, and to just confront that. And that means that one gets to make hopefully certain choices within that space. But yeah, let's just be honest about who we're working for. And that's not specific to games, that's true for all of us, I work for a university that's as expensive as this one is for its students, It's this unsustainable model, can't go on forever.
But your university has divested from fossil fuels.
We never really had much endowment to begin with. It really wasn't that hard,
More than NYU.
Yeah, it's true.
Big problem at NYU.
Yeah, but I'm not going to hold it out as any moral exemplar. So it's make beautiful games, but I think it's think through what the practice of being a game maker can tell you about the world, but to do so critically. Because we do tend to love the form that we work in, and probably that's a good thing. But to not love it unconditionally is maybe a good idea.
Nice. All right. I think that is what we have time for. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
McKenzie.
Thank you for coming.